There's a problem with most retirement planning advice that nobody wants to talk about. It's designed for retirements that last 15 to 20 years. You retire at 65, you live to 80 or 85, and the math works out. But here's what the statistics actually show. A healthy 65-year-old today has about a 50% chance of living past 85, a 25% chance of living past 90, and a 10% chance of living past 95, which means if you're planning for a 20-year retirement, there's a very good chance you're planning to run out of money before you die. And running out of money at 85, when you potentially have another 10 years to live, when you're too old to work, when healthcare costs are at their highest, that's not just uncomfortable. That's catastrophic. Warren Buffett has always approached money with extreme conservatism when it comes to spending and extreme optimism when it comes to planning timelines. He plans like he's going to live forever. And while that might seem excessive, it's actually the right framework for retirement planning. Because the cost of planning for too short a retirement is running out of money. The cost of planning for too long a retirement is dying with money left over, which isn't really a cost at all. Your heirs benefit or charities benefit, but you're not hurt by it. So the asymmetry is clear. Plan long, plan for 30 years minimum. Plan for 35 if you retire early or have longevity in your family. And use strategies that are proven to work over those extended timelines. That's what we're going to cover today. 5 specific strategies that aren't theoretical, that aren't based on hoping everything works out, but that are proven through decades of research and real-world application to make retirement money last 30 years or more. These are the strategies that successful retirees use. These are the strategies that wealthy people use. And these are the strategies that, if you implement them correctly, will ensure you never run out of money regardless of how long you live. Strategy number 1, understanding and adjusting the 4% rule. Most people have heard of the 4% rule. You retire with a certain amount of money, you withdraw 4% of it in the first year, and you adjust that amount for inflation every year after. The research that created this rule, done by financial planner William Bengen in 1990s, showed that this strategy would have survived every 30-year period in market history going back to 1926. Which sounds great, except the rule was designed for exactly 30 years, and it was based on a 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio. And it assumed you would increase your withdrawal every single year for inflation regardless of market conditions. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The 4% rule works for 30 years. But if you need your money to last 35 or 40 years, 4% is too aggressive. Studies that have looked at longer retirement periods suggest that 3.5% is safer for 35 years, and 3% is the number if you want to be really conservative, or if you're retiring early and need the money to last 40 or even 50 years. Now, the difference between 4% and 3% sounds small, but it's actually huge in terms of how much money you need. If you want $50,000 a year in retirement income from your portfolio, at 4% you need $1.25 million. At 3.5% you need $1.43 million. At 3% you need $1.67 million. That's a difference of over $400,000 between the aggressive and conservative approach. So which should you use? It depends on several factors. How long do you expect to live? How much other income do you have? How flexible can you be with spending? If you have a pension or substantial Social Security that covers your basic needs and your portfolio is just for extras, you can be more aggressive. Maybe 4% or even 4.5% is fine because worst case you reduce the extras. But if your portfolio is your primary income source, if you're depending on it for food, housing, healthcare, all your essential expenses, you need to be conservative, 3 to 3.5%. Because running out of money isn't an option. And here's something most people don't know. The 4% rule isn't actually 4% every year. In the original research, successful retirements often saw withdrawal rates that varied significantly from year to year based on market performance. In good years, the portfolio grew enough that you could withdraw more. In bad years, you might need to withdraw less to avoid depleting the portfolio too quickly. This brings us to an advanced concept called dynamic withdrawal strategies, which we'll talk about in Strategy 5. But the key point here is that 4% is a starting point, not a rigid rule. And for retirements longer than 30 years, you probably need to start lower. Strategy number 2, building multiple income streams in retirement. Warren Buffett is worth over $100 billion, but he doesn't live off his wealth. He lives off the income his wealth generates. Berkshire Hathaway pays him a salary. His investments pay dividends, and he never touches the principal. This is the model you want to replicate at whatever scale makes sense for your situation. You don't want to be dependent on a single source of income in retirement. You want multiple streams so that if one falters, you're not in crisis. For most people, retirement income comes from 3 or 4 potential sources. Social Security, which for most people will be somewhere between $15,000 and $40,000 per year depending on your work history. Pensions, if you're lucky enough to have one, which are becoming increasingly rare but still exist for many government workers and some long-term corporate employees. Your investment portfolio, which is what we just talked about with the 4% rule. And potentially part-time work or side income, especially in the early years of retirement when you're still healthy and active. The goal is to structure these income streams so that your essential expenses are covered by guaranteed or very stable income, and your discretionary expenses are covered by portfolio withdrawals. So, for example, let's say you need $60,000 a year to live comfortably in retirement. Your Social Security is $30,000. You have a small pension that pays $10,000. That's $40,000 in guaranteed income that covers your basic needs, housing, food, healthcare premiums, utilities, the essentials. The remaining $20,000 comes from portfolio withdrawals for travel, entertainment, dining out, the things you want but could cut if necessary. This structure is much more secure than depending entirely on portfolio withdrawals for all $60,000. And here's where it gets interesting with Social Security. You have a choice of when to start taking it. You can take it as early as 62, but your benefit will be reduced by about 30%. You can wait until your full retirement age, usually 66 or 67, and get your full benefit. Or you can delay until 70 and get an extra 32% on top of your full benefit. For every year you delay between full retirement age and 70, your benefit increases by about 8%. That's an 8% guaranteed return, which is better than almost anything else you can get risk-free. So if you have other resources, if you have portfolio assets you can live on in your early 60s, delaying Social Security until 70 is usually the right move, especially if you expect to live a long time. Because that higher benefit, that extra 32%, it's for life, and it's inflation adjusted. If you live to 90, that decision to delay will have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Warren Buffett's approach to retirement income, even though he doesn't need to worry about it personally, has always been to prioritize guaranteed income streams and preserve capital. And that's exactly what this strategy does. Strategy number 3, dynamic asset allocation that changes as you age. There's an old rule of thumb that says your allocation to bonds should equal your age. So at 60% bonds, 40% stocks. At 70% bonds, 30% stocks, and so on. The idea is that as you get older, you need to be more conservative because you have less time to recover from market crashes. But this rule was created when retirements were shorter and when people didn't live as long. For a 30-plus year retirement, this rule is actually too conservative. If you're 70% in bonds at 70 and you live to 95, inflation is going to destroy your purchasing power because bonds don't keep up with inflation. Over long periods, the research on this is clear. For retirements lasting 30 years or more, you need significant stock exposure throughout retirement. Not 100% stocks, that's too volatile. But somewhere between 30 and 60% stocks even into your 80s and 90s. Because stocks are the only asset class that historically outpaces inflation over long periods. And Inflation is your biggest enemy in a long retirement. If inflation averages 3%, which is conservative, prices double every 24 years. So something that costs $50,000 when you retire at 65 will cost $100,000 when you're 89. Your income needs to double just to maintain the same lifestyle, and bonds don't do that. Stocks do, so what's the right allocation? It depends on your risk tolerance and your other income sources. But a reasonable approach for someone retiring at 65 and planning for 30-plus years might be 60% stocks, 40% bonds at retirement, gradually shifting to 50-50 by 75, and maybe 40-60 by 85. You're becoming more conservative, but you're never abandoning stocks entirely, because you need the growth to fight inflation. And even at 85, if you live to 95, you still have a 10-year time horizon. That's long enough to recover from a market crash. That's long enough to need inflation protection. Warren Buffett has famously said that his instructions for his wife's inheritance are 90% stocks, 10% bonds. Now, that's more aggressive than most people should be, but it shows his thinking. Stocks are the long-term winner. And if you're planning for a long retirement, you're a long-term investor even after you stop working. The key is balancing the growth you need with the stability you want, and rebalancing regularly so you're not taking too much risk when stocks are high or missing out on gains when stocks are low. Strategy number 4, planning for healthcare costs, the number one retirement destroyer. This is the strategy that most people completely overlook, and it's the one that causes the most retirements to fail. Healthcare costs in retirement are enormous, and they're growing faster than general inflation. Fidelity estimates that a 65-year-old couple retiring today will need about $315,000 just for healthcare costs over their retirement. That's not including long-term care. That's just regular medical expenses, insurance premiums, prescription drugs, and out-of-pocket costs. And here's the problem. Medicare doesn't cover everything. It covers a lot, but there are gaps. You need supplemental insurance, you have copays, you have deductibles. Prescription drugs can be expensive even with Part D coverage. Dental and vision aren't covered. And the big one that destroys retirements, long-term care. If you need to go into a nursing home, the average cost is about $9,000 per month. Over $100,000 a year. Medicare doesn't cover this. Medicaid will, but only after you've spent down almost all your assets. So if you need 3 years of nursing home care and you don't have long-term care insurance, that's $300,000 gone. That can completely wipe out a retirement portfolio. So how do you plan for this? First, understand that healthcare will be one of your largest expenses in retirement. Maybe 15 to 20% of your total spending. Budget for it. Don't assume it'll be cheap just because you have Medicare. Second, consider long-term care insurance. The policies are expensive, especially if you wait until you're older, but the peace of mind might be worth it. At minimum, have a plan for how you'd pay for long-term care if you needed it. Third, max out your health savings account if you're still working and eligible. HSAs are triple tax advantaged. Contributions are tax deductible, growth is tax-free, and withdrawals for healthcare are tax-free. It's the best retirement account that exists if you use it right. Save your receipts for medical expenses, but don't withdraw from the HSA. Let it grow. And then in retirement, you can use it tax-free for all those healthcare costs. And fourth, stay healthy. This sounds obvious, but it matters enormously. The healthier you are, the lower your healthcare costs. Exercise, eat reasonably well, don't smoke, maintain a healthy weight. These things can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in healthcare costs over a 30-year retirement. Warren Buffett has joked that he's lived this long on a diet of hamburgers and Coca-Cola. But he's also been actively involved in his business and mentally engaged his entire life. There's something to be said for staying active and having purpose. It's good for your health and your wallet. Strategy number 5. Flexible spending, the secret weapon for long retirements. This is the strategy that takes everything we've talked about and makes it practical. The 4% rule assumes you withdraw the same inflation-adjusted amount every single year regardless of market conditions. But that's not how real life works. In reality, successful retirees adjust their spending based on how their portfolio is performing. And research shows that this flexibility dramatically increases the sustainability of retirement portfolios. Here's how it works. You set a base withdrawal rate, let's say 3.5% for a long retirement. But instead of increasing it for inflation every single year automatically, you look at your portfolio performance. If your portfolio had a good year, if it grew despite your withdrawals, you can give yourself a raise for inflation or even a little more. If your portfolio had a bad year, if it declined because markets were down, you keep your withdrawal flat or maybe even cut it a little. You tighten your belt, you skip the expensive vacation, you eat out less. Small adjustments in spending during down years prevent you from depleting your portfolio when it's already down, which is the biggest risk in early retirement. This is called a dynamic spending strategy or a guardrails approach. You set upper and lower bounds for your spending. Maybe your base spending is $50,000 a year, but you're willing to spend up to $60,000 in good years and as little as $42,000 in bad years. That 20% range in either direction gives you enormous flexibility. And studies show that retirees who are willing to cut spending by just 10% during market downturns can start with withdrawal rates as high as 5% and still not run out of money over 30 years. The flexibility is the secret. It's the release valve that prevents portfolio failure. Now, most people resist this idea. They say, I worked my whole life, I don't want to have to cut spending in retirement, and I get that. But here's the alternative. You can be inflexible, stick rigidly to a fixed spending amount, and risk running out of money at 85. Or you can be flexible, adjust spending when necessary, and ensure your money lasts your entire life. Which would you prefer? Temporary modest spending cuts in bad years, or permanent poverty in your final decade? And here's the thing. The spending cuts don't have to be dramatic or painful. You're not cutting food or medicine. You're cutting discretionary stuff, the second vacation, the expensive dinners, the new car, the things that are nice but not essential. And you're only cutting them temporarily. When markets recover, and they always do eventually, your spending can go back up. Warren Buffett has lived his entire life with flexible spending. He doesn't spend based on what he could afford. He spends based on what he needs and what brings him genuine value. That mindset, that discipline, it's what allows wealth to last, not just for a lifetime, but for generations. Putting it all together. So let's summarize what a secure 30-plus year retirement looks like using these 5 strategies. You start with a conservative withdrawal rate, 3 to 3.5% of your portfolio, adjusted for how long you expect your retirement to last. You build multiple income streams, Social Security, maybe a pension, portfolio withdrawals, possibly some part-time work early on so you're not dependent on any single source. You maintain a stock-heavy allocation even as you age, maybe starting at 60% stocks and slowly moving to 40 or 50%, because you need growth to fight inflation over 3 decades. You plan explicitly for healthcare costs, budgeting 15 to 20% of spending for medical expenses and having a strategy for long-term care. And you build flexibility into your spending, willing to cut back in bad markets and increase in good markets, which dramatically improves the odds your money lasts. If you do these 5 things, if you implement these strategies, the research is clear, your money will last, not just 30 years, 40 years, 50 years if you retire really early, because you're using approaches that have been tested across every market environment in modern history. You're not depending on luck. You're not hoping markets stay strong. You're building in buffers and flexibility that allow you to weather any storm. And that's what retirement security actually is. Not having so much money you can't possibly spend it all, but having a plan robust enough to handle whatever life and markets throw at you. Warren Buffett is in his 90s and still working, not because he needs the money, but because he loves what he does. But his approach to money, the conservatism, the multiple income streams, the flexibility, The long-term thinking, those principles work whether you have $100 billion or $1 million. The math scales. The strategies scale. And if you apply them to your situation, adjusting for your specific needs and resources, you can have the same security he has. The security of knowing that no matter how long you live, no matter what markets do, no matter what healthcare costs emerge, you'll be fine. Your money will last. And that's the only goal that matters in retirement planning. Not dying with the most money, but never running out while you're alive?